sorrow prevention. I'm going to address some things this morning, but wish to just give an illustration of that. A young woman was brutalized, tortured, and doused with gasoline and set on fire by a crowd, 6 of whom led the whole thing. A psychologist in court argued that the 6 men in the crowd who led this atrocity were not guilty because, quote, to be poor is to have a built-in excuse for violence, end of quote. And that these men had become de-individuated, quote, quote, since they acted in a group. The judge let them off. That a girl was burned alive due to the evil intent in the hearts of these 6 men. The moral is, do something in a group and you can get off free. And Isaiah says, woe to those who take away the right of the ones who are in the right. What's going on in our society? What's going on around the world? A student dormitory assistant at Carnegie Mellon University, Patrick Mooney, told school officials he objected to homosexual activity in the dorms because it, quote, contradicts the Christian values by which I govern my life. All he did was object. Free speech. I object. I don't like this. A school administrator told him this view made him unable to be effective in the RA position. This is the basis, this administrator said, for my decision to terminate your employment. Whatever happened to free speech? Memphis State University recently dismissed Professor Byron Johnson because, as the university's vice president put it, Johnson did not fit in, quote, quote. His words, fit in. Johnson was urged to, quote, consider teaching at a small private institution more closely with Johnson's religious beliefs, end of quote. His religious beliefs got him fired from the university. At Southern Methodist University, a professor brought a witch to his class to conduct satanic rituals as a way to, quote, broaden his students' quote, quote, horizons. Whereas Professor Philip Bishop at the University of Alabama was ordered in a letter from his department chairman to stop referring to God or Christ in his classes. Satan is welcome, we see, but Jesus Christ, as the greatest figure who ever lived, cannot be mentioned. You can say, oh God, you can say, God damn it, you can say, Jesus Christ, as long as it's cursing. But if you say any of that in a reverent way, in that school's context, you are ordered not to. At Penn State, where school funds are given to the gay student activities to present favorable information on gays, Penn State denied funds to a Christian group intending to show the dangers of Satanism. Quote, the university denied the funds because the film offended Satanists and did not present the good points of Satanism. Gaten Dugas, a French-Canadian and homosexual who most believe introduced AIDS into this culture, had an insatiable sex appetite, boasting of 250 homosexual experiences in a year. When informed by the doctors of his medical condition and that he was contributing to the potential death of many people, he gave the sickening, this culture's enlightened view. Quote, it's my right to do what I want. It's my body. It's my right to do what I want with my body. Why? Well, Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965 and Roe versus Wade in 1973 gave him that right in some way. He later became known as the Merchant of Death. He consciously and willfully went about having sex and then saying to his quote, quote, gay partners, I've got gay cancer. Maybe you'll get it too. The issue of rights is before us, as Dr. Paul Cameron states in the AIDS scandal. He's also the one that discovered the secondhand effects of cigarette smoking. Up to this point in our medical history, when there has been a medical epidemic, quote, 1, the community has a right to protect itself against the spread of disease. And two, it has a right to minimize how much it has to pay for that protection. He says the homosexual community is telling us today that, one, we have no right to protect ourselves from disease if in the process they will be embarrassed or inconvenienced. And two, we have the financial obligation to foot the entire bill for AIDS, including the enormous hike in our insurance rates. Cameron points out that no epidemic in our history has been permitted to continue, no medical epidemic. For instance, when syphilis was seen as a national threat, 18,000 prostitutes were quarantined to slow its spread. This has been true of leprosy, smallpox, bubonic plague, influenza, etc. Until medical cures exist, we quarantine. As Cameron says, quote, "Never until now has anyone sold any society on the idea that the individual has the right to infect." You're living in a unique period, folks. You're going to watch our nation die. They're hoping the technology will solve it, but there is no hint that that's coming at this point. He goes on to say, from Leviticus to the present, civilized people have always assumed that the person who has a contagious disease is a special case, though he is no less human. Let me underscore that. Though he is no less human and no less valuable, he loses, most often through no fault of his own, some of the rights of citizenship, while retaining most of them. The rights he loses are those relating to his contact with the community at large, since he poses a present danger to the survival of all. Cameron points out that most people think, for instance, penicillin was responsible for curtailing syphilis. Untrue. It was already under control due to the Surgeon General's efforts. Thomas Perron developed a program of testing, tracing, and treating that altered the epidemic before penicillin had been discovered as such. That treatment that he enacted was quarantine. Now, people who say quarantine is antiquated, since the diseases of the past can be cured medically, fail to see an obvious point. Though medical cures do replace the need for quarantine, where there is no medical cure, quarantine is still necessary. And where there is no medical cure, the right of the community takes precedence over the right of the contagious individual, until now. Now the rights of the infected to infect the whole community take priority over the larger community who are still in the right. And Isaiah says, woe to that person, woe to that nation, who take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. In fact, woe to those who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. Isaiah says in this portion of Scripture that as a result of this, God may lovingly knock us down through ill health and even death. Scripture teaches that. Right on the heels of that, he says, on this account, they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account, the anger of the Lord has burned against his people, and he has struck down his hand against them and struck them down. Struck his hand against them and struck them down. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the streets. God may lovingly knock us down through ill health and even death. God may lovingly use authorities to put us anywhere he wishes. 5:13, he had said, therefore my people go into exile. He had whistled for Assyria, as we pointed out, and Assyria came. He's of other authority. He will also lift up a standard to the distant nation and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth. And behold, it will come with speed swiftly. This whole issue of authority, and my heart goes out to the homosexual community. Unless they begin to deal with this honestly and openly, they're going to be at a war with this nation. And they will be put into a position that I hate to think about, unless they begin to act in a way that polices themselves and begins to be honest about this issue. But they at this point have refused to do that. Among themselves, they do not, and they will not, at any point, reveal everything that's going on. They just won't do that. They know that it's bad enough. But God may lovingly use authorities to put us anywhere He wishes, and I don't know what might happen. And my heart goes out to what might happen in this nation. Thirdly, God may lovingly decrease our stability, that is, weaken our inner strength or our security. He says their root will become like rock. And God may lovingly decrease our outer attractiveness, physically will decay. Their blossom will blow away like dust. Referring to the outer man. They'll just shrivel up and die. So picturesque, unfortunately, of what's going on. That by way of introduction. I'll come back to that. But we're looking at Isaiah, and Isaiah was an upper-class individual. And he was an intellectual, one of the most brilliant writers in the centuries of known writers. And he addresses Judah. And he addresses the elite in many ways. The people that we see here, he unfolds 6 sorrows. He says, sorrow is coming, but you can prevent this sorrow. You don't have to encounter this headache and heartache. But there are lines over which we step. And God says you must not overstep that boundary. If you overstep that line, if you move into the margin of error, if you move into the rim of sin, there are consequences. Now I'm telling you, don't do this. If you lay down in a patch of poison ivy, you're going to get poison ivy. We've known through the centuries that venereal disease will happen from promiscuity sexually. We've known that. And we knew, and it was predicted that there would be a strain possibly developed. This was back in the 70s. People said, you can't continue to have this free sex and expect nothing to happen. There are people who are predicting, we don't know, but we know something's going to happen bad here. Up to now, we've hoped that technology would be able to solve our problems. People were not ignorant of this. We've known through the centuries that if you continue to promote this kind of promiscuity, multiple partners, a non-monogamous relationship, that it will lead to this kind of disease. You lay down in poison ivy, you get poison ivy. People say, well, is this God's judgment? I think indirectly it definitely is. We know that there's a law of nature, and we exalt environment, we exalt nature, and yet we're ignoring it here. And that whole stuff, I was just disturbed greatly by the quote-unquote genetic findings that homosexuality is that. If you will read those findings, they will acknowledge they're not sure whether homosexual decisions does that to the brain, first of all. But do you think that they promoted that? They should have neutralized it as social scientists. It is shoddy research. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? But they reversed it and said, the brain stuff here, which is very questionable research, affects the homosexuality. When you've asked them, could it be, sir, honestly, as a social scientist, that homosexuality has affected the brain that way? Well, yeah, it could be, honestly, but I'm not going to go on, I'm not going to say that. And I hope that no person asked me that. It's there in the document. You can see it if you read it. But we're going to espouse one perspective. And the man who was in that was a homosexual. His homosexual partner died after 21 years. He said, if I don't find in this research what I hope to find, I'm stopping all research. Talk about bias. He acknowledged that. That was his intent. How we twist it around. It's just very disturbing. But when we overstep that boundary, we know, and God says, don't do that. You can prevent this. But no. And so I pointed out last week several key things. We pointed out that these woes. Woe to those, verse 8. I'd like to turn to Isaiah 5. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there's no more room, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. And we pointed out there the difficulty of amassing possessions to enable selfish seclusion and segregation from others. There's nothing wrong, giving you a review now, with amassing stuff. But if my motivation is to be independently wealthy so that I come out from any kind of accountability in community, any accountability and authority, I want to be free, I want to be my own person, we pointed out the danger of that. He says, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. That was their desire. I don't want to be a part of Israel. I want to be my own person. I want to live independently. Any kind of confrontation, any kind of authority. I want to retire, go south. Oh, we'll go to church periodically, but I want to fish. I want to play golf. I don't want to minister. I don't want to have any kind of responsibility. We've amassed this, and now I'm happy. And Jesus said to the man who said, I'm going to build bigger barns, and I can eat, drink, and be merry, and I can sit back and take my ease. And Jesus said, you fool, this night your soul will be required of you. We've tracked in some ways the fact that some Christian men, as a result of making that kind of decision, are dead within 2 years. It's frightening. It's frightening. Like the Lord said, if you're not going to minister for me, there's no point in you being on earth. I can't prove that. Everything has its natural causes, and yet we've seen this tracking. How many of you can name Christian people, non-Christian people? We say, oh, well, see, he gets out from underneath all that hard pressure, and his heart just expands, and boom, blows up, and he's dead, and we put all this, that's just what happens. Well, how do you think God might do it? I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to explain all this. I'm just saying to us in our own hearts, if my purpose is to come out from under authority, to be independently wealthy, I can be free from you. I don't have to give any account. I can do what I want when I want to do it. I'd have us evaluate, oh God, I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of you. This isn't what you'd have me do. To have things is okay, but my motive isn't right. God, I confess, I agree with you, that I'm headed in a direction that isn't good. Then, secondly, woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. And their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine, but they do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, nor do they consider the work of his hands. Am I drinking and partying which suppresses thoughts of God and hinders reverence of God? And we ask that. And then also, woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, verse 18, and sin as if with cart ropes. In other words, they were tied into sin, cords and ropes. They were tied into. They had a sin in their life that they didn't want to let go of. And then who say, let God make speed, let him hasten his work that we may see it, and let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass that we may know it. In other words, we want God to act in our lives. We want to know the will of God. But he is saying, Isaiah, you've got a sin in your life by will and by conscious decision that you want. You don't want to let go of that. And yet you're giving the appearance that you want God to answer prayer. You're giving the appearance that you want to know God's will. And you're saying, that, my friend, is hypocrisy. You're taunting God. You're mocking God. God has been speaking about dealing with that sin in your life, repenting of it, but you're saying, no, I want it. But I want to project to all the believing community that I'm very spiritual. Oh, God, would you act in such a way that I can see it? Oh, God, would you reveal truth from your word? But then when you go off, you've got this sin in your life that you want, and you will not give up. And the Lord says, whoa! And then last week we saw another woe. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And we pointed out there, am I redefining goodness and badness to fit my selfish agenda, ignoring God's revelation? And needless to say, I pointed out numerous illustrations of this. And as I pointed out, and this is what's so sad, if I were to get up into a certain environment over at the university, let's say, and share some things I'm sharing with you, I would be turned around in every which attempt to point out that I'm the evil one and I'm the one who's a threat to society.
For the conclusion of this message, please turn your cassette to side 2.